There is a specific kind of silence that exists only at 3:47 in the morning inside a glass tower on Park Avenue. It is not peace. It is not rest. It is the silence of a building that never truly sleeps. A low electric hum beneath the floors, the muted percussion of cooling systems breathing through steel vents, the faint glow of 47 monitors casting pale blue light across a room where almost no one sits. Almost no one. Daniel Reyes sat in that room every night. He had been sitting in that room, in that specific chair, at that specific desk for 6 years. He knew every sound the building made. He knew the exact moment the heating system switched from its nighttime setting to its early morning cycle. 4:12 a.m., a small click followed by a soft shudder through the walls that most people would never notice. He knew which elevator had a slightly longer door delay. He knew that the vending machine on the 31st floor dispensed coffee that was approximately 12 degrees cooler than the one on the 29th. He knew these things because he had spent thousands of hours inside this building while the rest of the city slept, watching numbers move across screens, watching the invisible machinery of global finance breathe in and out through the night. What Daniel did not know, what none of them had yet understood, was that somewhere deep inside that machinery, something had already gone catastrophically wrong. He just didn't know it yet. His name, on his ID badge and on the building's employee roster, was Daniel Alejandro Reyes. His title was Senior Overnight Reconciliation Analyst. In practical terms, what that meant was this. Every evening at 11 p.m., Daniel arrived at Meridian Capital Group's global headquarters, took his seat in the overnight operations suite on the 31st floor, and spent the next 8 hours doing the work that no one in daylight hours wanted to think about. Reconciliation is not a glamorous word. It does not appear in headlines. No one at a dinner party asks you to explain overnight reconciliation with genuine curiosity in their eyes. But what reconciliation actually means in the context of a bank that processes north of $300 billion in daily transaction volume is something closer to this. Every dollar that moves through Meridian's systems during the trading day has to be accounted for with surgical precision before the next trading day begins. Every position, every swap, every clearing obligation, every counterparty settlement, each of them leaves a mark in the data, and each of those marks has to align perfectly across a system of 12 interlocking ledgers before the Asian markets open at 9 a.m. Tokyo time. If they don't align, you do not sleep until they do. Daniel had not slept properly in approximately 4 years. He told himself it was the job. The night shift, the irregular hours, the constant low-grade vigilance required to sit alone in a room and stare at numbers until patterns emerged from noise. He told himself that. But the truth that lived in the quiet space behind his eyes during his subway rides home when the city was just beginning to wake and he was just beginning to surrender to exhaustion, was something more personal and more painful than shift work. The truth was a small human being named Sophia. Sophia Reyes was 8 years old. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn jaw and a laugh that sounded, Daniel had once told a coworker who had asked him to describe her, like something you'd want to bottle and carry in your pocket for the hard days. She liked astronomy books and hated math homework, which Daniel found both ironic and heartbreaking in roughly equal measure. She slept in a room decorated with glow-in-the-dark stars pressed to the ceiling, each one placed there by Daniel on a Saturday afternoon 2 years ago, both of them standing on his bed in their socks, laughing at each other's placement decisions. Sophia's mother had left when Sophia was 4. Not dramatically, not with shouting or scenes, but quietly, the way certain things end, not with a crash, but with a slow withdrawal, like tide going out. Her name was Maria, and Daniel did not speak badly of her to Sophia, had never spoken badly of her, because whatever had broken between them was between them, and Sophia deserved the space to form her own understanding of her mother in her own time. What Daniel knew was this: Maria was gone, and Sophia was here. And Sophia needed her father to be present, even when that father was running on 4 hours of sleep and cold vending machine coffee and the particular kind of willpower that only single parents who love their children with everything they have seem to be able to manufacture from pure exhaustion. So Daniel worked nights. He had never complained about this. That was important to understand about Daniel. He was not bitter. Bitterness requires a certain amount of energy, and Daniel was too tired to be bitter. He was simply doing what needed to be done, quietly, carefully, night after night, in the blue-lit silence of the 31st floor while the city dreamed around him. On the night that everything changed, Daniel arrived at his desk at 10:53 p.m., 7 minutes before his shift officially began. This was his habit. He liked the 7 minutes. He used them to arrange his workspace, open his reconciliation queues, check the overnight position reports that the trading desks had filed before market close, and drink the first of what would typically be 4 cups of coffee before dawn. He liked the 7 minutes because they were his. No alerts yet, no flags, no discrepancies demanding his attention. Just him and the screens and the city glowing 40 floors below. He had a photo of Sophia on his desk. Just one. It was taken at the Bronx Zoo 18 months ago. Sophia mid-laugh in front of the red panda enclosure, her hair escaping its braid in approximately 7 different directions, her eyes crinkled almost shut with the kind of joy that 8-year-olds access, with an ease that adults spend entire therapy sessions trying to remember how to find. Daniel had looked at that photo every single night for 18 months. Some nights, it sustained him. Some nights, it just made him tired in a different way than the job made him tired. Tonight, he propped it slightly forward, the way he always did, and opened his first queue. The numbers were normal. They were always normal at 11 p.m. The irregularities, when they appeared, usually surfaced between 2 and 4 a.m., artifacts of late clearing systems in London and Frankfurt, timing mismatches in currency hedges, the occasional fat finger trade from an exhausted desk that the automated flags caught but that required human sign-off to resolve. Daniel had seen thousands of these in 6 years. He could diagnose most of them in under 10 minutes. What he could not know, as he settled into his chair and pulled up his first screen, was that tonight's irregularity was not an artifact of anything. It was not a fat finger. It was not a timing mismatch. It was a crime. The name Jeffrey Ashworth III appeared in Meridian Capital Group's organizational chart at the very top, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer, the kind of title that comes on heavy cream-colored business cards that people keep rather than throw away. Jeffrey was 53 years old, silver-haired in the way that certain men become silver-haired and immediately look more powerful rather than older, and possessed of the absolute unwavering self-certainty that decades of institutional deference can build in a person until it becomes indistinguishable from bone. He had joined Meridian 30 years ago as an analyst, the same entry point as dozens of other ambitious young men from similar schools with similar backgrounds, and had risen through a combination of genuine intelligence, political shrewdness, and an almost preternatural ability to identify and align himself with the direction things were heading before anyone else in the room had figured it out. He was not stupid. This was crucial to understand. Jeffrey Ashworth was not stupid, and the disaster that would unfold in the coming hours was not born from stupidity. It was born from something more dangerous, intelligence so accustomed to being correct that it had lost the capacity to seriously entertain the possibility of being wrong. He had never, in 30 years at Meridian, apologized for a professional decision. He had never, to anyone's knowledge, sat with genuine uncertainty for longer than it took to manufacture confidence. And he had certainly never, in the 30 years he had spent climbing toward and then occupying the top chair, paid meaningful attention to the overnight reconciliation desk. Why would he? The overnight reconciliation desk was furniture. It was infrastructure. It was the financial equivalent of the plumbing. You expected it to work, and you noticed it precisely when it didn't, and when it didn't, you called a plumber. You didn't invite the plumber to the table. You didn't learn the plumber's name. Jeffrey Ashworth did not know Daniel Reyes's name. He was about to. The earnings call was scheduled for 8 a.m. Eastern, live streamed to investors across 17 time zones. Meridian's Q3 results were strong. At least the parts of them that Jeffrey had reviewed in his pre-call briefing the previous afternoon were strong. Revenue up 11%. Assets under management at record levels. The language in the prepared remarks was aggressive and celebratory, the kind of language that communicates to institutional investors that leadership is not merely confident, but offensively so, which is a specific kind of signal that certain investors find reassuring. What Jeffrey's briefing materials had not flagged, because the analyst who prepared them had pulled from the primary reporting system rather than the reconciled overnight figures, was a discrepancy. A small discrepancy in the context of a balance sheet the size of Meridian's almost invisible, a $4.7 million gap between two settlement accounts in Meridian's European Structured Credit Division. The kind of gap that almost certainly had a boring procedural explanation, a timing difference, a currency conversion artifact from the Frankfurt clearing system. Something that Daniel would have found, diagnosed, and resolved by 5 a.m. had the morning proceeded normally. But at 7:43 a.m., 17 minutes before the earnings call went live, Jeffrey's communications director, a high-energy woman named Priya Saunders, who had been awake since 5 and was running on ambition and cold brew, noticed the discrepancy in the supplemental materials she was preparing for the investor Q&A. She flagged it. The question went up the chain in the way questions go up chains in organizations where everyone is afraid of arriving at the top with bad news. By the time it reached Jeffrey's chief of staff, it had been framed not as a question but as a problem, and by the time Jeffrey heard it, standing in the glass-walled war room adjacent to his corner office, adjusting his tie in the reflection of the window while Manhattan spread below him in the early morning light, it had been framed as a failure. Overnight reconciliation didn't catch it, his chief of staff, Marcus Webb, said. Marcus was 38 and excelled at delivering bad news with the calm affect of a man reporting weather. There's a 4-7 gap in the European structured credit settlements. It's going to come up in the supplementals. Jeffrey looked at his reflection for a moment longer than was comfortable. What's the name of the overnight reconciliation lead? Marcus checked his phone. Reyes, Daniel Reyes. Get him up here. Daniel was still at his desk when the call came. This was unusual. His shift ended at 7 a.m., and it was now 7:51, and he was still at his desk because he had noticed something in the last 40 minutes of his shift that he had not been able to explain and therefore had not been able to leave. It was small. It was the kind of thing that a less experienced eye might categorize as noise and move on from. But Daniel had 6 years of nights in this room, and his eye was not less experienced, and what he was looking at did not look like noise to him. It looked like a pattern, a specific, deliberate, almost elegant pattern buried inside what appeared to be a routine sequence of automated trading settlements. He had not had time to fully map it. He was still mapping it when Marcus Webb appeared in the doorway of the overnight suite and told him that Mr. Ashworth wanted to see him immediately. Daniel looked up from his screens. He registered the word immediately. He looked back at the pattern on his screen, at the thread he had been following for the last 40 minutes, at the shape of something that he did not yet have a name for, but that his gut, the gut of a man who had spent 6 years watching numbers in the dark, was telling him was significant. "Can I have 10 minutes?" he said. Marcus Webb's expression communicated that 10 minutes was not an option. Daniel saved his work, tagged the anomalies he had flagged, and followed Marcus to the elevator. The conference room where Jeffrey Ashworth was waiting was called the Meridian Room, and it occupied a corner of the 42nd floor with floor-to-ceiling windows that faced north and east. A view so comprehensive on a clear morning that you could see the pale geometry of the Bronx in one direction and the shimmer of Long Island Sound in the other. It was a room designed to make its occupant feel large and everything else feel small. Jeffrey was standing when Daniel entered. This was theater, Daniel understood immediately. The studied positioning of power, the choice to stand rather than sit so that the other person is always slightly in the position of having entered someone else's space. Jeffrey's posture communicated that he had already formed his conclusion and that this conversation existed not to establish facts, but to confirm a narrative he had already written. There were 4 other people in the room: Marcus Webb, Priya Saunders from Communications, Richard Tao from the CFO's office, and a woman Daniel didn't recognize who was later identified to him as Meridian's outside counsel, flown in for the earnings call. The earnings call that was now 11 minutes away from going live. Daniel recognized the dynamic before Jeffrey spoke. He had seen versions of it before, not at this altitude, not in a room with this view, but in the fundamental human geometry of it. He recognized it. Someone needed a story. Someone needed an explanation that was simple and contained and pointed in a specific direction. And Daniel, the overnight reconciliation analyst who was technically responsible for the discrepancy in the supplemental materials, was the direction they had already pointed in. "Mr. Reyes," Jeffrey said. His voice had the particular timbre of a man who has spent decades being listened to. "I understand we have a gap in the European structured credit settlements that your team was responsible for catching overnight." Daniel looked at him steadily. He was exhausted. 8 hours of overnight shift exhausted, the kind of exhausted where your eyes feel like they're resting on sandpaper. But he was also alert in the specific way that confrontation in a room full of powerful people makes a person alert. "There's a 4.7 million discrepancy in the Frankfurt clearing settlement," Daniel said. "I'm aware of it. I was in the process of running it down when I was called up here. It's likely a timing artifact from the late London close, but I hadn't confirmed the source yet." "Hadn't confirmed it?" Jeffrey repeated the words with a specific inflection, the kind that transforms a neutral statement into an indictment. "We are 9 minutes from a live call with institutional investors representing $40 billion in assets, Mr. Reyes, and your department hasn't confirmed a discrepancy in the supplemental materials." "I was running it down," Daniel said again, and there was something in his tone, not defiance, but a quiet precision, the voice of a man who knows what he knows. That seemed to briefly interrupt Jeffrey's script, but only briefly. "This is a failure of the overnight process," Jeffrey said, pivoting to address the room rather than Daniel specifically, the way a conductor turns to face the orchestra when he wants the sound to fill the hall. "A significant one. The integrity of our reporting materials is non-negotiable, and that integrity begins with accurate reconciliation data. Richard, I want a full review of the overnight protocols, and as of this morning, Mr. Reyes is relieved of his responsibilities pending that review." The room was silent for a moment that felt considerably longer than it was. Daniel looked at Jeffrey Ashworth for exactly 3 seconds. He was doing something in those 3 seconds that Jeffrey would not have recognized as anything other than passivity, because Jeffrey was not practiced in reading the faces of people who process information quietly. What Daniel was actually doing was making a decision. Not about his career, not about the conversation, about the pattern on his screen downstairs, the one he had been tracing for 40 minutes, the one he had not yet been able to name, the one that his gut was speaking to him about in a language that bypassed language. He decided he needed to get back to those screens. He did not say this. He said, "I understand." He retrieved his ID badge from the security desk as a formality. He rode the elevator down to the 31st floor, collected his jacket and his bag and the photograph of Sophia mid-laugh in front of the red panda enclosure and walked to the elevator that would take him to the lobby. At 8:07 a.m., as Jeffrey Ashworth began his earnings call with the confidence of a man who had just taken decisive action, Daniel Reyes walked out of Meridian Capital Group's headquarters into the white morning light of Park Avenue. The 6 train at 8:15 a.m. is a specific kind of crowded, not the shoulder-to-shoulder compression of the evening rush, something slightly more humane but no less relentless, the city's morning metabolism finding its rhythm. Daniel found a seat near the door, which rarely happened at this hour and which he attributed to some small mercy of the universe, and he sat with his bag on his lap and his jacket folded across his knees, and he stared at his reflection in the dark glass of the window across the car. He had been fired, or something close enough to fired that the distinction was not presently interesting to him. He had been removed from his position in front of an audience in a room that cost more per square foot to furnish than his monthly rent by a man who did not know his name 20 minutes before the conversation happened. He had been made an explanation. He sat with this for approximately 45 seconds. Then he opened his phone. He had screenshots. Before he left his desk, operating on the particular autopilot of a man who trusts his instincts even when he can't yet articulate why, he had taken screenshots of the screens he'd been working on, the anomaly screens, the pattern he hadn't had time to map. He opened the first screenshot. The 6 train moved north, and Daniel Reyes looked at numbers on his phone screen, and the city moved past the windows, and the morning light changed as the train went underground, and something began to happen in Daniel's mind that he would later struggle to describe to the people who asked him to explain it. It was not a sudden revelation. It was more like he searched for the right language, like watching a photograph develop, like standing in a dark room and watching something emerge from chemical patience, first outline and then shadow and then detail, until the image was undeniable. The pattern was not a Frankfurt clearing artifact. The pattern was not a timing mismatch. The pattern was, as best as Daniel could read it from screenshots on a subway car on the 6 train heading toward Woodside, Queens, at 8:22 in the morning. The pattern was a deeply embedded algorithmic instruction set that had been inserted into Meridian's automated trading infrastructure and was executing, right now, in real time, in small enough increments across enough accounts that no single automated flag would ever catch it. But in the aggregate that Daniel's 6 years of overnight pattern recognition were allowing him to see from a series of screenshots on a phone screen, in aggregate, it was redirecting capital, systematically, deliberately, across dozens of positions, across multiple asset classes, across time zones, moving money in increments that fell below every threshold designed to detect it. Moving money out. He didn't know yet how much. He didn't know yet where it was going. What he knew, with the certainty of a man who has spent 6 years watching the legitimate movement of money in the dark, and who therefore knows what illegitimate movement looks like when he sees it, was that this was not a discrepancy. This was a mechanism, and it was running right now. Daniel sat very still on the 6 train. The car swayed, someone's bag pressed against his arm. A child 2 rows ahead of him was asking his mother a question she appeared to be too tired to answer. The city moved past the windows in gray and white and occasional color. He thought about the earnings call, about Jeffrey Ashworth on a live feed to institutional investors right now as the train moved north, about the pattern he had seen in the data, about the Asian markets, Tokyo, Hong Kong, Singapore, which would open in approximately 12 hours, about what would happen to those markets if what he was looking at was what he thought it was, and if it continued running unchecked for another 12 hours. He thought about Sophia, asleep in their apartment in Woodside, under her glow-in-the-dark stars. He looked at his phone for a long time. Then he called the only person at Meridian whose number he had saved and who was not Jeffrey Ashworth. Her name was June Park, and she was Meridian's deputy chief risk officer, and she had started at the bank 2 years ago from a regulatory position at the Federal Reserve Board. She was 39, meticulous in the way that people who have worked in regulation are meticulous, and she had the specific gift of knowing when something was above her pay grade and the courage to act on that knowledge quickly. She had met Daniel exactly twice, once in a cross-functional meeting about overnight risk reporting protocols, once in the elevator when they had exchanged maybe 30 words, but she had given him her direct line because the kind of people who are serious about risk know the value of direct lines to the people who watch the data in the dark. She answered on the second ring. June Park. This is Daniel Reyes, overnight reconciliation. I need to talk to you. A pause. She knew the name. She had heard, through the way information moves in organizations, that Jeffrey had relieved him this morning. The fact that he was calling her now from what she assumed was outside the building told her something about the quality of what he was about to say. Talk, she said. He talked for 4 minutes. He described the pattern. He described the mechanism as best he could extrapolate it from screenshots. He described what he thought it was doing and what he thought would happen if it continued. He was precise and he was calm, and he did not editorialize, and he did not mention the conversation in the Meridian room or the fact that he had been told to leave. He simply described what he had seen. When he finished, June Park was quiet for a moment. "Where are you?" she said. "On the 6 train, about 8 minutes from my stop." Another pause, longer this time. "Can you get back to your desk?" "I no longer have access." "I'll fix that. How fast can you get back to the building?" Daniel looked at the subway map on the wall of the car. Calculated. 40 minutes if I catch the express." "Make it 35, June Park said. "And Daniel," she paused again, "don't tell anyone else what you just told me until you're back in the building." He called Mrs. Ortega from the platform at 86th Street after he got off the 6 and was waiting for the downtown express. Mrs. Ortega answered immediately, the way she always did, with the patient warmth of a woman who had raised 4 children of her own and understood without needing it, explained that a man raising a daughter alone sometimes needed his plans to change without notice. "Sophia's fine," she said before he could ask. "She woke up at 7:30 and she's eating breakfast. She wanted to know if you were coming home soon." Daniel closed his eyes for 1 second. "Tell her I'll be a little late. Tell her—" He stopped, started again. "Tell her the stars are still up there even when it's daytime. She'll know what that means." Mrs. Ortega said she would tell her. Daniel hung up as the express train arrived in a wave of compressed air, and he stepped on, and he did not think about Sophia again for the next 3 hours, because if he thought about her, he would think about going home instead, and going home was not an option. The situation he returned to was not yet a crisis. It was the moment before a crisis, that specific atmospheric pressure, that particular held breath quality that anyone who has been near a genuine institutional emergency will recognize. The people who were aware of it moved slightly too fast and spoke slightly too quietly, and there was a precision to their eye contact that communicated, "We are not panicking, but we are not far from it." June Park met him in the lobby with a temporary access card and an expression that communicated several things simultaneously. That she had made calls in the 35 minutes since he'd phoned her, that those calls had been difficult, and that she was not entirely certain she had done the right thing, but was committed to it. She walked him to the elevator without speaking. In the elevator, she said, "Jeffrey doesn't know you're back in the building." "Okay," Daniel said. "Richard Tao in the CFO office is aware you're here. 2 people from technology. And I've called Federal Reserve Compliance. They're not yet involved, but I've opened the line." She paused. "What you described on the phone, how confident are you?" "Confident enough to get back on a train going the wrong direction," Daniel said. She looked at him. Something crossed her face that might have been the beginning of respect, still forming. Okay, she said. Let's go. The next 2 hours existed in a different quality of time than the hours that preceded them. This is not a metaphor. People who have worked through genuine financial emergencies describe it this way: a compression and simultaneity that normal language struggles to hold. You are in 5 conversations at once. You are reading data that is changing as you read it. You are communicating certainty to people who need certainty while privately holding uncertainty with both hands. Your body forgets that it is tired. Daniel forgot that he was tired. He sat at a workstation in Meridian's technology risk suite, not his desk. His desk was now technically off limits, but a comparable terminal with access to the systems he needed. And he began the process of mapping what he had seen. Fully this time. Not from screenshots on a phone, from the data itself. What emerged over the following 90 minutes was this. 7 months ago, a series of algorithmic subroutines had been introduced into Meridian's automated position management system. They were embedded inside what appeared to be a standard performance optimization package, the kind of low-level systems update that technology teams deploy routinely and that almost no one outside the technology division pays attention to. The subroutines were elegant. Whoever designed them understood Meridian's detection thresholds with the specificity of someone who had worked inside the institution or been given access to its internal risk documentation. The transactions they executed were, individually, unremarkable, small, precisely calibrated to remain below the automated alert triggers. But cumulatively, over 7 months, across more than 1,100 individual transactions in 14 different asset classes, they had moved a significant amount of capital through a chain of shell counterparties in a pattern that was designed to terminate in accounts outside Meridian's visibility. The number, when Daniel finally had enough data to estimate it, appeared in the middle of a spreadsheet formula at 10:47 a.m. He stared at it for a moment. He typed it into a different cell to confirm his calculation. He printed the sheet and walked it to June Park, who was on a call in the adjacent glass-walled room. She looked at the number. She held up one finger to the person on the call. She looked at the number again. Then she said quietly to the phone, "I need to call you back." And she ended the call. 11.8 billion, Daniel said, because she appeared to need it said out loud. Over 7 months, she said, across 14 asset classes, and it's still running. The mechanism is still active. It's been executing all morning. He paused. The discrepancy I flagged last night, the 4.7 million gap in Frankfurt clearing, that wasn't an artifact. That was the mechanism bumping up against a settlement threshold. It created a surface irregularity for the first time because the total volume being moved has been increasing. It's been accelerating. June Park was very still for a moment. If it continues through today, the Asian markets open tonight, Daniel said. If this unwinds into open markets without controlled disclosure, the exposure isn't just Meridian's. The counterparty chain goes to at least 4 other major institutions. The contagion risk... He stopped. He did not finish the sentence because the end of the sentence was not something he was comfortable saying out loud in the present tense. June Park finished it for him, quietly to herself, looking at the number on the printed sheet. "Who designed this?" she said. It was not quite a question. "I don't know yet," Daniel said, "but whoever designed it had access to Meridian's internal risk parameters. The detection thresholds it's calibrated to avoid, those are not public information." They looked at each other for a moment. "I need to make some calls," June Park said. "I need more access," Daniel said. "Full access to the trading infrastructure logs. I need to trace the counterparty chain." "You'll have it," she said. Then, almost as an afterthought, the way important things sometimes emerge. "Thank you for calling me." Daniel nodded once. Then he went back to the workstation. Jeffrey Ashworth was in a post-call debrief with his investor relations team when Marcus Webb appeared in the doorway with the expression of a person who has been asked to deliver something they would prefer not to deliver. Marcus was very good at his job. He had delivered difficult information to Jeffrey Ashworth on numerous occasions. He had never, in 7 years as Jeffrey's chief of staff, had to deliver information that felt, in the moment of its delivery, like the ground shifting. "We have a situation," Marcus said. Jeffrey looked at him. "June Park called up from Risk. She's been working with—" Marcus paused for one half-second that Jeffrey, who was practiced in reading Marcus's pauses, registered immediately. "She's been working with the overnight reconciliation analyst, Reyes. He identified something in the systems." Jeffrey's expression did not change, but something behind it did. "I thought he was relieved this morning." "He was. He called June from a subway train." Marcus delivered this with the flat precision of someone who understood that the details mattered here. "She brought him back in. She brought him back in without my—" Jeffrey. Marcus used his name, which he rarely did, which was its own signal. "I think you need to see what they found." The walk from the 42nd floor to the Technology Risk Suite on the 31st took approximately 4 minutes by elevator and corridor. In those 4 minutes, in the elevator specifically, Jeffrey Ashworth was alone for the first time since the earnings call ended. He stood facing the elevator doors, and he was aware of something unfamiliar pressing against the interior of his chest. Not pain, nothing physical, but a specific quality of pressure that his body was producing in response to information it had received and was now processing in ways that his conscious mind was still several steps behind. He had fired Daniel Reyes 4 hours ago, in front of witnesses. On the morning of a live earnings call, he had used the word failure. He did not know yet what Daniel had found. He was about to. The elevator opened onto the 31st floor. The Technology Risk Suite was, by the standards of Meridian's interior design language, utilitarian. A large open room of workstations and screens, less glass and more cable management than the executive floors, the kind of space that communicated function over impression. Daniel was at a workstation in the center of the room, surrounded by approximately 8 other people now, technologists, risk analysts, 2 people from compliance, most of them younger than him, all of them moving with that compressed urgency. Daniel was not moving urgently. This was the thing that Jeffrey noticed first, without quite understanding why he noticed it. In a room full of people who were visibly calibrated to emergency, Daniel was still. Not the stillness of shock or paralysis, but the stillness of deep concentration, the particular physical quality of a mind that is fully occupied. He was looking at data on a screen, and his right hand was moving slowly over a notepad, and his coffee, his 3rd or 4th of the morning, a paper cup that someone had brought him without being asked, was sitting untouched near his left elbow. He had been at this workstation for 3 hours and 20 minutes. Before that, he had worked an 8-hour overnight shift. He had been awake for approximately 19 hours. He did not look up when Jeffrey entered the room. June Park intercepted Jeffrey before he could approach the workstation. She walked him to the side of the room and, in a voice calibrated to not carry, delivered a 12-minute summary of what Daniel had found and what it meant. Jeffrey listened. He was very good at listening when the alternative was worse, and he understood, by the 3rd minute of June's summary, that the alternative here was considerably worse than listening. When she finished, Jeffrey was quiet. "How contained is this?" he said. "It's not contained, not yet. The mechanism is still active. Daniel is working on a shutdown sequence now. We need to terminate the subroutines without triggering the position unwindings that would make this visible to the market before we can manage the disclosure. Can he do that?" June Park looked at him in a way that she could have chosen not to, but chose to. "He's been here for 3 hours, she said. "And yes, he can." Another silence. Then Jeffrey said, more quietly than he had said anything in perhaps years, "I need to speak with him." Jeffrey Ashworth walked to the workstation where Daniel Reyes was sitting and stopped. He stood there for a moment. Daniel finished the sequence he was running, documented it in the log, then looked up. The two men looked at each other. There is a specific quality to the silence that exists between a powerful man who has made a significant mistake and the person he made it against. It is not comfortable. It is not redemptive, not yet. It is simply accurate. A moment in which reality asserts itself with complete indifference to anyone's preferences. "Mr. Reyes," Jeffrey said. "Mr. Ashworth," Daniel said. Jeffrey looked at the screens, at the data, at the printed sheets spread across the workstation surface, Daniel's notations in the margins, the counterparty chain mapped in his handwriting, the numbers that told the story of 7 months of invisible theft. "Tell me what you need," Jeffrey said. It cost him something to say it that way. Both of them knew that. Daniel looked at him for a moment. "Full administrator access to the trading infrastructure," he said. "A direct line to your technology architecture team. And I need whoever designed this optimization package 7 months ago in a room where I can ask them questions." Jeffrey nodded. Then, "What else?" "Nothing else," Daniel said. "I'll let you know when it's done." Jeffrey turned to leave. He had reached the edge of the workstation cluster when Daniel spoke again. "The 4.7 million gap," Daniel said, "that I flagged last night, that was the mechanism generating its first detectable surface artifact as the transaction volume accelerated. It wasn't a reporting error." He paused. "It was the mechanism trying to hide." Jeffrey stood with his back half-turned for a moment. He did not say anything. He walked to the far side of the room and stood at the window and looked at Manhattan below him for a long time without speaking to anyone. What Daniel did over the next 4 hours was this. He traced the counterparty chain to its origin. He found the shell entities, 6 of them, in 4 jurisdictions, that the mechanism had been feeding. He mapped the beneficiary structure with the precision of a man who had spent 6 years finding hidden connections between things that appeared unconnected. And he designed a shutdown sequence for the algorithmic subroutines that could terminate their operation without triggering the position unwindings that would have made the theft visible to the market in real time. The shutdown had to be elegant. It had to look, from the market's perspective, like a routine position adjustment. Nothing alarming, nothing that would cause a sophisticated algorithmic trading system on the other side of a position to flag unusual behavior and start selling. It had to be simultaneously decisive and invisible, the kind of technical solution that is entirely impossible to describe to a non-specialist audience and that required Daniel to hold approximately 14 variables in active consideration simultaneously while typing sequences into a terminal at a speed that caused the technologist sitting next to him to quietly say, at one point, that she had never seen anyone work a trading architecture system this fast. Daniel didn't respond. He was thinking. At 2:37 p.m., he ran the shutdown sequence. The room watched the screens. For 11 seconds, nothing appeared to change. The data streams continued their flow. The position reports updated on their normal cycles. The market feeds scrolled. Then, on the third screen from the left, a specific set of transaction identifiers, the subroutine fingerprints that Daniel had spent the morning isolating, stopped appearing in the settlement queue. They simply stopped. The mechanism had been terminated. Daniel sat back in his chair for the first time in 4 hours. The technologist next to him exhaled. Someone behind him said something quietly to someone else. June Park, standing at the edge of the workstation cluster, closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. "It's done," Daniel said. To no one specifically. To the room. To himself. The legal and regulatory process that followed was not Daniel's domain. The FBI, the SEC, and the Federal Reserve's Enforcement Division were notified within the hour. The beneficiary accounts, identified through Daniel's counterparty mapping, were flagged for asset freezing through proper channels. The individual whose access credentials had been used to introduce the algorithmic subroutines 7 months ago was a former Meridian technology officer who had left the firm the previous year under circumstances that had been described at the time as voluntary and were now being re-examined with considerably more scrutiny. The total amount that had been redirected over 7 months, confirmed by forensic accounting over the following days, was $11.8 billion. Not yet gone. The shutdown sequence had been executed before the final transfer through the last shell entity could be completed, and the majority of the capital remained in traceable intermediate accounts. But the intent and the mechanism were unambiguous. $12 billion, the headlines would say. Close enough to the truth for the kind of truth headlines deal in. At 4:15 p.m., Daniel Reyes finally left the building. He walked out onto Park Avenue into a late afternoon that was doing what late afternoons in October in New York City do. The light going gold and sideways, the shadows lengthening, the air with that particular edge that is not quite cold, but is no longer warm, the city's particular autumn smell of exhaust and turned leaves, and someone's coffee from a cart on the corner. He sat down on a low concrete ledge outside the building's entrance, which he understood was probably not a thing that anyone sat on, but he didn't care. He sat down. He put his bag beside him. He put his face in his hands for a moment, not crying, just resting, just giving his face somewhere dark and still to be for 30 seconds. He thought about the number 11.8 billion. He thought about 7 months of precision theft executed in the dark, invisible to every automated system designed to detect it, invisible to every analyst who sat at the reconciliation desk during the day shift. He thought about the 4.7 million discrepancy he had flagged at 3 a.m. and what might have happened if he had not been the kind of person who notices things. He thought about Jeffrey Ashworth saying the word failure in front of witnesses. He thought about Sophia. He called Mrs. Ortega. "Is she still up?" he said. "She was waiting for you," Mrs. Ortega said. "I think she's been waiting since noon. She won't say so. You know how she is." He did know how she was. "I'm on my way," he said. When Daniel walked through the door of their apartment in Woodside at 6:02 p.m., Sophia was at the kitchen table doing her homework. She looked up when the door opened. She was wearing the blue sweatshirt with the solar system on it, the one she'd gotten at the Natural History Museum last spring, and her hair was in a loose braid, and there was a pencil tucked behind her ear in a way that he recognized as unconscious mimicry of a habit he didn't know he had until he saw her do it. She looked at him. The way children look at their parents when their parents have been away longer than expected, and have returned looking the particular way Daniel looked at that moment, tired, resolved, still vibrating slightly with the residue of something enormous. "Dad," she said. "Hi, Bug," he said. She put her pencil down and got up from her chair and walked to him, and she put her arms around his waist, and he put his arms around her, and they stood there in the kitchen doorway for a moment that required no language. Then she leaned back and looked up at him with her father's dark eyes. "Mrs. Ortega said the stars are still up there even when it's daytime," she said. "She said you said that." "I did say that." "Why did you say that today specifically?" He looked at her for a moment. "Because today specifically I needed to remember it," he said. She studied him the way 8-year-olds study things they find genuinely interesting, with a quality of attention that adults mostly lose and rarely recover. Then she nodded, as if this were a satisfactory answer, and went back to her homework. Daniel sat down at the kitchen table across from her and watched her work, and for a long time, he didn't say anything at all. 3 weeks after the events of that October morning, Jeffrey Ashworth requested a formal meeting with Daniel Reyes. Not in the Meridian room, not on the 42nd floor. In Jeffrey's private office, with no audience, no chief of staff, no outside counsel. He was already seated when Daniel arrived, which was notable. He sat with his hands on his desk, and he looked at Daniel directly, and he said what he said without preamble. "I made an error in judgment on the morning of the earnings call, a significant one. I made it in front of witnesses, and I made it about you specifically, and I want to acknowledge that directly." He paused. "I was wrong." Daniel sat with this for a moment. "Okay," he said. "I'd like to offer you a role," Jeffrey said. "Head of overnight risk architecture. You would build the team, design the protocols, set the parameters, reporting directly to the Deputy Chief Risk Officer." A pause. "To June Park." Daniel looked at him. He noticed that Jeffrey was meeting his eyes in a way he had not on the morning of the earnings call. Without theater, without studied positioning. Simply two people in a room. "I'd want certain things specified in writing," Daniel said. "Name them." "My shift structure is non-negotiable. I have a daughter. My hours have to accommodate that." He paused. "The overnight desk needs 3 additional analysts, experienced, properly compensated. The protocols I design cannot be overridden without my sign-off and June Park's sign-off simultaneously. And the algorithmic monitoring systems I put in place cannot be modified by the technology division without risk desk approval." Jeffrey nodded throughout this list without interruption, which was unusual enough that Daniel noticed it. "Is that everything?" Jeffrey said. "One more thing," Daniel said. "The 4 people who were in the room on the morning of the earnings call, I don't need an apology from them, but I need this offer documented officially so that the context of what happened and what I found is part of the institutional record." Jeffrey held his gaze for a moment. "Consider it done," he said. They shook hands. It was a different kind of handshake than either of them had experience with. Not the handshake of equals in the conventional sense, not the handshake of a superior acknowledging a subordinate. Something more honest than either of those. The handshake of 2 people who understood what had passed between them and had decided, for reasons each of them held privately, to move forward. On a Thursday evening in November, Daniel Reyes sat on the edge of Sophia's bed after lights out and looked up at the glow-in-the-dark stars they had pressed to the ceiling together 2 years ago, standing on his bed in their socks. He had taken the overnight role. He had taken it on his terms, which were the only terms worth taking anything on. He had built the team he'd asked for. He had designed the monitoring architecture that would go live in the new year. He was sleeping, somewhat more than before. Not enough, probably never enough, but more. He was still tired. He suspected he would be tired for a while. That was all right. He knew what tired was. He had learned to carry it. Sophia was looking at the stars, too. "Dad," she said, in the particular voice she used when she was about to ask something she'd been constructing for a while. "Yeah. At school they said a person can't really do something impossible. That impossible means it can't be done." She paused. "Is that true?" He thought about this. He thought about a 6 train at 8:22 in the morning, screenshots on a phone, patterns that revealed themselves like photographs developing in a darkroom. He thought about $11.8 billion finding the light. "Impossible usually just means nobody's been looking at it long enough," he said. She was quiet for a moment. He could tell she was processing this. The specific contemplative quiet of a child moving information into the places where it fits. "Like the stars," she said finally. "They're there even when you can't see them." He looked at the ceiling. The small points of green light, patient and arranged and constant. "Exactly like the stars," he said. He turned off the lamp and sat in the dark for a moment, listening to her breathing slow. Outside, the city made its sounds, distant, continuous, the particular voice of 10 million lives moving alongside each other in the dark. Inside this room, under this ceiling, in this quiet, everything that mattered was present. He stayed until she was asleep. Then he went to make his coffee. Some people see what others overlook, not because they were given better eyes, but because they never stopped looking, even when the world told them there was nothing worth seeing.